I went on to the internet, as one does. And if you Google crisis in UK modern languages, you get 4 million results. But if you Google the future of UK modern languages, you get 9 million results. So from that, I think that great oracle suggests that there might still actually be a future for modern languages in this country. Although you wouldn't necessarily think that from reading some of the results produced by that first Google search. And the facts are stark, and I'm sure you've heard them repeated over and over again. Just 2 of the most striking ones. The number of teenagers studying a modern language has dropped by 1/3 in the last 7 years. Studying modern languages is becoming a pursuit for elites, as Deering pointed out. 1/4 of pupils on free school meals take at least one modern foreign language, but 3/4 of independent school pupils do so. Now, if there is a future, I'm afraid it's not going to be much thanks to your politicians. Of all parties, this is not a party political point. I mean, I think this is really a failing of a timid and unimaginative political class in this country. Politicians for years have produced often warm words about modern languages, paid tribute to how important they are, and said a lot of the things that Carol has said, but not actually meaning it as she has so passionately done today. And actually, for many years, politicians, again, both governments, the last government of which I was a member, and I'm still proud to be a member, to have been a member, and this current government have pursued educational policies which, no matter how well-intentioned they may be, have actually profoundly damaged not only the study of modern languages in this country, but actually of the humanities as a whole. And that is really what you need to tackle. There are 2 sorts of arguments, I would suggest, for studying modern languages. There is a utilitarian one, that you need to be able to talk to the people you trade with in their language. And then there is a citizenship one, national citizenship one and a global citizenship one, in that a facility in another's language opens the door to a different kind of understanding of those cultures, and in a way that develops uniquely personal skills in empathy and understanding. And those are skills, those so-called soft skills, that all of us think are desirable both on a personal, political, and indeed on an economic level. Now, of course, those 2 arguments aren't incompatible. Indeed, they're complementary. But in practice, politicians, not just socialist politicians always have to speak the language of priorities. Very simple headlines. And today's politicians, I think, often have difficulties in a way that politicians of previous generations never really did quite have these difficulties in quite this way, for reasons that I won't go into now. But they do have difficulties with any arguments other than the strictly utilitarian. Successive governments have tried to find ways of keeping and improving Britain's competitiveness in an increasingly global economy. And as a result, educational priorities have been linked more and more to measurable economic outcomes. And that's at every stage: primary, secondary, higher education, and postgraduate education. And while this is narrow-minded, of course it's understandable, politicians have to be able to justify the taxpayers' money that they spend. These are simple arguments that everybody can sign up to. No one is seriously going to argue with them. But they're not sufficient. Necessary, they are, but they are not sufficient arguments. And this is a big problem for modern languages, because to get beyond those arguments is very hard. And if you couch the argument purely in utilitarian terms, the problem is that it appears that those utilitarian arguments for study of modern languages are not as compelling as they are for other subjects. Now, I agree with everything that Carol has said, and I want to support what she said in a moment, but on the surface, it is sometimes quite difficult to make this case. Globalization, this extraordinary phenomenon that we're living through, of epochal significance, actually suggests that English is the universal language of commerce, and where it isn't, the rise of the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the extraordinary rise of these very large countries with dynamic economies growing at an enormous rate, is forcing to the front languages which are different from those that are traditionally studied in this country. And the whole problem is compounded by this quintessentially British attitude towards Europe, which is uninterested for the most part, and where it is interested is largely hostile. This is a big problem. Carol has mentioned what a problem it is. And it's not surprising that given politicians' disproportionate focus on the obviously utilitarian and what I think is a misperception of the greater utility of other subjects, it's not surprising that young people are not flocking to study modern languages. Now, this requires, if this trend is to be reversed, it requires a major shift, and this has to come from government. It's going to take a very, very long time for this to turn around on its own, spontaneously, organically, from people making choices from their perceptions of the world. I mean, that's a generational time frame. If it's going to change more rapidly, government has to get involved. And to get government involved means that a sufficiently persuasive case has got to be made for them to overcome what are always worries about politicians about interfering in student choices, interfering with the front line. I mean, they often do, but it remains the fact that for all parties, including my own, the idea of being a top-down centralist is something that you have to avoid at all costs. All parties chant the mantras of choice, although incidentally, and this is the one political point I will make tonight, is that sadly this government talking about choice don't seem to have realised that their reforms to university education are going to, in practice, restrict effective choice to only those who can afford it. Anyway. What might the case be to politicians? Now, I hope it's always going to include the civilising effects of understanding and empathising with other cultures through their language. But I think politicians are inevitably going to be more likely to be swayed by economic arguments. And here there is a crucial fact that we must never forget. Europe is our backyard. Whatever is happening in China and India and in Brazil and in Russia, the European Union still accounts for over half of our overall trade and foreign investment. And that is not likely to change significantly in the future. Of course we have to get into these new and rapidly developing markets. Of course we do. But we should never forget that for all sorts of reasons, good, strong economic reasons, Europe is going to remain fundamental. And it is clearly extremely damaging not to be able to do business in the language of our customers. And Carol put it, I thought, if I may, extremely well. We have to be able to speak these languages. I've just heard from Professor Coleman, the 5th most popular language that's studied is Dutch. We need to be able to speak the language of our major trading partners. And this is particularly the case as increasingly our business is going to be in service industries, not in manufacturing, although I hope we will still continue to make things, and my constituency made a lot of motor cars, for example, and I hope long may continue to do so. But in service industries, the culturally specific nuances, the idea of sustaining relationships, not just with one deal, but over long periods of time, being able to speak in the language of your customers is fundamentally important. And we will lose business unless we are able to do so. Now, the consequences of our failings in modern languages may not make headlines, but cumulatively they can be extremely costly. And I want to give just one example, just one very small technical example. But when I think you look about it and you think this is multiplied over and over again, I think it exemplifies how problematic this is. Because there are so few British linguists in Brussels, the English versions of some legislation inevitably is produced by non-native speakers. So as I understand it, when the legislation was passed dealing with the duty on linen, it was negotiated in French. And it was translated by a non-native speaker who referred to the duty not on linen, but on flax. Now, you all know that flax is the fibre. and linen is the product. Now, a native speaker would have picked up the difference. Now, it may sound like a detail, but imagine how much judicial time, how much lawyers' time, how much taxpayers' money, and how much private sector money was involved in trying to decide how that law should be applied, how much uncertainty there was for the businesses concerned. Now multiply that many, many times, and I think you can see and you know how big a problem this is. Now, I want to end just on a note of hope and some point as to how we might make some progress in future. I hope these sorts of arguments that I've just outlined will begin finally to gain more traction as time goes on. But there's also, I think, cause for hope in some other educational reforms that are being introduced for other reasons, which have all sorts of arguments for and against them. But I just want to point to two, which I think could, not will, but could help the study of modern languages in this country. I certainly think the English Baccalaureate could help steer more towards modern languages. I mean, it can be argued about whether it's a good or a bad thing. It's legislation still going through Parliament. But I think it could help the study of languages. And longer term, the escalating number of academies with their greater freedoms, I think could help a much needed move away from a Fordist model of education that in my view, has strangled secondary education for so long. And here I do take issue with Carol, because I think secondary education is really where the focus of effort should be. I mean, we can discuss this perhaps in a moment. But I think the spread of academies, and again there are arguments for and against it, but they do have greater freedom to move away from the national curriculum. They do have greater freedom to liberate the curriculum, to study things which at the moment are being squeezed out. And I think that could be very helpful in the future for the study of modern languages, as long as these other arguments continue to be made cogently and compellingly. And that's why this event is actually very important, because you're discussing these issues. I hope you will all be going away with lots of ideas which you can take back into your own professional areas of activity and start really making this case again and again and again. Politicians are not always deaf to good arguments. It can take a long, long time to change their minds. The process is sclerotic, and perhaps that goes with democracy. But sometimes you can persuade them. You will need to shout loudly if you want to do so. And I hope today can be a renewal of that loud shouting. Thank you.